Allow yourself to settle deeper into this moment, letting your shoulders release their tension as you sink into whatever surface holds you, feeling the warmth gathering around you like an invisible blanket, that particular quality of heat that speaks not of discomfort but of profound comfort, the kind of warmth that comes from within rather than pressing from without. This warmth is eternal, unchanging, the same quality of heat that the desert has known for millions of years, the same warmth that soothed the ancient Egyptians thousands of years ago. Imagine the desert air of Egypt wrapping around you like a gentle visitor, not harsh or demanding, but patient and eternal, carrying with it the accumulated heat of millennia, the warmth that has soaked into golden sand and ancient stone since the beginning of recorded time itself. This is the Valley of the Kings, that sacred gorge carved into the desert landscape by forces both geological and spiritual, a place where the silence runs so deep that it seems to have weight and substance, pressing against your ears with a kind of loving pressure that quiets all the noise and chatter and concerns of the modern world, replacing the chaos with something peaceful and infinite. The sand here is the colour of honey and amber, glowing in certain lights with an inner luminescence that seems almost alive, and it has witnessed countless generations of human beings flowing through it like water. Pharaohs and peasants, priests and soldiers, all returning now to the dust from which they came. The wind carries stories across this sand, stories that have travelled through the ages, stories of power and loss, of ambition and mortality, of the eternal human desire to leave something behind, to be remembered. Breathe in this silence. Let it fill the spaces inside you where worry and anxiety have been living, occupying space that could be filled with peace and presence, and know that you are safe here, held by time itself, suspended in a moment that stretches back 3,000 years yet feels as present as your own heartbeat, as immediate as your own breathing. The Valley of the Kings is a place of endings, yes, but also of preservation, a place where death and eternity have made their peace with one another, creating a kind of sanctuary where the dead rest undisturbed through the ages, where time itself stands still. We are travelling now to a specific moment in history, a moment that would change everything we thought we knew about ancient Egypt, and about the very possibility of recovering and understanding the past. A moment that would prove that the dead can speak to us across the millennia if we listen carefully enough. We begin our journey in the new kingdom of ancient Egypt, that golden age of pharaonic power and artistic sophistication that stretched across centuries and produced some of humanity's greatest monuments and achievements, works that still inspire awe in those who encounter them. The New Kingdom represents the height of Egyptian civilization, a time when the empire stretched far beyond the Nile Valley into Nubia and Syria, and beyond, when the pharaohs ruled with absolute authority, backed by the belief in their divine mandate, when the temples rose so high that they seemed to scrape the very heavens themselves, their interior spaces echoing with the chanting of priests and the prayers of the faithful. And when the artisans and craftspeople produced works of such exquisite beauty and precision that they would awe and inspire everyone who encountered them for all the ages to come. We are specifically in the 18th dynasty, that remarkable dynasty that produced some of Egypt's most famous pharaohs, including the great military conqueror Thutmose III, whose name struck fear into the hearts of Egypt's enemies, and the female pharaoh Hatshepsut, whose mortuary temple still stands as one of the most magnificent structures ever constructed by human beings, a monument to her power and vision. The 18th dynasty represented the absolute peak of pharaonic power, political, military, artistic and spiritual all at their zenith, reaching heights that would never be equalled again in subsequent dynasties. The pharaohs of this dynasty controlled vast territories that stretched across continents, commanded armies of extraordinary size and sophistication, disciplined and well-equipped, and accumulated wealth that would seem almost impossible to us in our modern age, wealth that allowed them to undertake massive building projects. They built monuments to celebrate their power and their connection to the divine, structures of stone that were meant to last forever, and they developed a civilization so complex and refined that it would outlast the pharaohs themselves by thousands of years in terms of its cultural and spiritual influence on the world, influencing everything that came after them. Within this dynasty, during the reign of a pharaoh named Akhenaten, something extraordinary and unprecedented happened, something that would send shockwaves through the established order and leave the kingdom reeling from the upheaval for generations to come. Akhenaten was a revolutionary, though perhaps not by choice. He seems to have genuinely believed that he had received a divine revelation, that the old polytheistic religion of Egypt was false and illusory, that there was in truth only one true god, the sun disk called the Aten, and that all other gods were either illusions or false constructs that had been keeping the Egyptian people in spiritual darkness and ignorance. This was not a small theological adjustment, or a minor reinterpretation of existing doctrine. This was a complete and utter rejection of everything Egypt had believed in, and organised its entire civilization around for thousands of years. Akhenaten didn't merely suggest this new religion, he imposed it with the full force of pharaonic authority, declaring that the Aten was the only god worthy of worship, and that the old gods, particularly Amun, who had been the supreme deity and the very foundation of Egypt's spiritual life, were to be suppressed, and their temples either repurposed or allowed to fall into disrepair and ruin. To solidify this religious revolution, Akhenaten made the audacious decision to physically relocate the capital of Egypt from Thebes, the ancient and sacred city that had been the heart of Egypt for centuries, to a new city he had built specifically to honour the Aten and to embody his revolutionary vision. This new city, called Akhenaten, which means the horizon of the Aten, was constructed in the desert hundreds of miles downriver from Thebes, and it was designed from the ground up to reflect Akhenaten's spiritual vision, with temples and palaces and administrative buildings all oriented toward the worship of the single sun disk. The move was traumatic for the Egyptian priesthood, particularly the priests of Amun, who suddenly found their temples closed, their authority undermined, their very reason for existence challenged by a pharaoh who seemed to have lost touch with the fundamental principles that had sustained Egyptian civilization since its beginning. The priesthood had accumulated vast lands and wealth and power over centuries, and Akhenaten's revolution threatened to strip all of that away, leaving them vulnerable and diminished in a way that they found utterly unacceptable. Into this world of upheaval and revolutionary fervour was born a child who would later be known as Tutankhamun, though his birth name was something different, something now lost to history in the confusion and chaos of those revolutionary times. We believe he was born around 1341 BCE, though exact dates from this period are uncertain, and scholars continue to debate the precise chronology with considerable passion. The young prince was born into a world that was fundamentally unstable, where the old religious certainties had been shattered and replaced with a new and controversial theology that the priesthood resented and the common people struggled desperately to understand. His father was Akhenaten, the revolutionary pharaoh who had single-handedly attempted to reshape Egyptian religion and culture, and his mother may have been one of Akhenaten's wives, though the details of royal succession and family relationships from this period remain shrouded in mystery and scholarly debate. What we do know is that the young prince grew up in the court at Akhenaten, surrounded by the radical spiritual experiment that his father had imposed upon Egypt, educated by priests of the Aten rather than the traditional priest of Amun, exposed from his earliest years to the revolutionary theology that had turned Egypt inside out and upside down. This young prince lived in a world of profound instability and uncertainty, where the foundations of everything were being questioned and reconstructed according to the vision of one man. The traditional priesthood had been displaced and was growing more hostile with each passing year, waiting for the moment when they could reclaim their power and authority. The common people were confused and sometimes resentful about the suppression of the gods they had always worshipped and appealed to for help and guidance in their daily lives. The kingdom's international relationships had become strained as foreign powers watched to see if this revolutionary experiment would succeed or collapse under its own internal contradictions. The young prince could not have known it at the time, but he was living through what historians would later recognize as one of the most extraordinary moments of discontinuity in all of human civilization, a moment when one person's vision, backed by absolute political power, could temporarily reshape an entire culture and reverse thousands of years of religious tradition and practice. But even as a young man, the prince was already being prepared for something else, something that would eventually undo his father's revolution and restore the old order. When Akhenaten died, the young prince inherited a kingdom in crisis, a kingdom that was spiritually fractured and confused, politically weakened by the years of upheaval, and increasingly vulnerable to foreign powers that had been growing stronger while Egypt had been consumed with internal religious warfare. He could not have been more than 9 or 10 years old when he inherited the throne, too young to make any real decisions, too inexperienced to navigate the complex political forces that surrounded him and threatened to tear the kingdom apart. What he did have, however, was advisors, two men in particular who would shape his reign profoundly and whose influence would eventually transform the trajectory of Egypt and undo everything his father had built with such dedication and passion. The first of these advisors was a man named Ai, a powerful figure who had served in Akhenaten's court and was possibly related to the royal family, and the second was a general named Horemheb, a military man of considerable authority and ambition. Between the two of them, they represented the forces of reaction and restoration that were determined to undo Akhenaten's religious revolution and return Egypt to the spiritual foundations that had sustained it for so long and that they believed were eternal and unchangeable. These advisors, working with the young king who was too young to resist their guidance, began immediately to reverse the religious policies of Akhenaten with systematic thoroughness. They closed the temples dedicated to the Aten and allowed them to fall into ruin and obscurity. They reopened the temples of Amun and the other traditional gods, restoring them to their former prominence and authority. They moved the capital back to Thebes, abandoning Akhenaten and returning to the ancient city that had been the heart of Egypt for centuries. They began a systematic campaign to erase the memory of Akhenaten and his revolution, defacing his monuments and erasing his name from historical records as though he had never existed, as though his entire reign had been a mistake that needed to be undone. The young pharaoh, guided by these advisors who held the real power, ruled for approximately 10 years, a decade during which Egypt gradually returned to spiritual and political stability and equilibrium. The temples were restored, the priesthood of Amun regained their power and their authority and their vast wealth, and the kingdom began to heal from the wounds of the revolutionary period. The young pharaoh, whose name had been changed to Tutankhamun to honor the restoration, became a symbol of continuity and healing, a living representation of the return to the old ways and the old gods. He became the instrument through which the revolution was undone and the traditional order was restored. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe to the Calm Archive and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always check the comments, and it's fascinating to see people from all over the world all drifting off to the same ancient stories just hours apart. Anyway, back to ancient Egypt. But the restoration came at a cost, and the young king paid that cost with his life. After about 10 years of rule, at the age of approximately 19, Tutankhamun died suddenly, and under circumstances that remain mysterious even to this day, even to modern medical science and DNA analysis. The cause of his death is still debated by historians and archaeologists and medical experts. Some suggest illness, others propose injury or trauma from a fall or chariot accident, and some have even entertained the possibility of foul play, though definitive proof remains elusive and hidden by the passage of 3,000 years. When Tutankhamun died, he was buried in a small tomb in the Valley of the Kings, a royal burial that would have been attended by all the ceremony and ritual that the Egyptian priesthood could muster, with all the treasures and provisions that a pharaoh would need for his journey into the afterlife. The tomb was sealed with ancient prayers and spells written on its walls. The entrance was hidden beneath the rubble and the dust, and Tutankhamun was left to rest in the darkness, surrounded by his treasures and protected by ancient magic and the weight of millennia. The burial ceremony would have been solemn and sacred, attended by priests in their white linens, mourners wailing in prescribed rituals that had been practiced for centuries, musicians playing mournful melodies, the sound of chanting filling the valley as the body of the young king was placed in his tomb to rest eternally. The priests would have spoken the sacred words, performed the rituals that they believed would allow Tutankhamun's soul to navigate the dangerous journey through the underworld and arrive safely in the field of reeds, that paradise of Egyptian belief where the souls of the righteous dwelt in eternal peace. Every ritual, every spell, every prayer was meant to protect the young pharaoh in his eternal journey. He would remain there undisturbed for over 3,000 years, and in that time the entire world would change in ways that the ancient Egyptians could never have imagined. Civilizations would rise and fall, religions would be born and die, human beings would learn to harness electricity and split the atom and send machines into space, would develop technologies that seemed like pure magic to the ancients, and yet Tutankhamun would remain, preserved in his tomb, undisturbed and untouched, waiting for the day when curious humans would find their way back to him. Tutankhamun's name would fade from memory as the dynasties passed. His tomb would be forgotten by living memory, and the location of his burial place would be lost in the sands and the confusion of the centuries as dust accumulated and time worked its subtle erosion. The Valley of the Kings held many tombs, scores of burial places for pharaohs and nobles and important officials, and most of them had been discovered and explored and often looted by grave robbers and adventurers over the centuries, their contents scattered or sold to collectors or museums in Europe, their secrets revealed to the modern world. Workers and priests had cut roads and built structures in the valley, had constructed walls and cleared areas, and in all this activity, the small tomb of Tutankhamun was covered over, forgotten, lost beneath the rubble of centuries. But Tutankhamun's tomb would remain hidden beneath that rubble, waiting in the darkness, secure in its obscurity, waiting for the moment when the world would be ready to encounter the young king again, for the moment when the right person, with the right obsession and determination, would decide to search for him against all odds and all reason, and against the skepticism of nearly everyone around them, against the conventional wisdom that said the valley had been exhausted and all its secrets revealed. The valley held its secrets in layers of dust and sand, and beneath that covering, in the darkness that no one had penetrated for 3,000 years, Tutankhamun waited, surrounded by his treasures and his golden furniture, surrounded by the objects that he would need in the next life according to the ancient beliefs of his people. Howard Carter was born in Norfolk, England in 1874, a boy who showed little promise of becoming one of archaeology's most celebrated figures, one of the most famous names in the history of archaeological discovery, a man whose name would be remembered long after his death. He was not born to privilege or academic excellence. His family was modest, his father a painter of animals whose work was unremarkable but honest. His education was limited and conventional, the ordinary schooling available to a boy of his class. He showed no early signs of genius or exceptional achievement in his schooling, no indication that he would become famous. What he had instead was a talent for drawing, a genuine gift for capturing detail with pencil and brush, for rendering what he saw with accuracy and care, and a restless curiosity about the world that burned inside him like a quiet flame that would never be extinguished. At 17 years old, Carter made a decision that would reshape his entire life and send him on a journey that would ultimately make him immortal in the annals of archaeology, that would ensure that his name would be spoken with respect and wonder by future generations. He was offered a position in Egypt, not as an archaeologist, a profession that barely existed in its modern form, not yet fully established or professionalized, not yet truly recognized as a legitimate discipline, but as an artist. He would go to Egypt to record monuments and inscriptions through careful, detailed drawings, preserving on paper the visual record of a vanishing past, documenting what others had not bothered to preserve. Egypt changed him in ways that nothing else could have, transforming a young man with a talent for drawing into a visionary archaeologist. The light there, golden and unrelenting, the sheer scale of the monuments that dwarfed human beings into insignificance, making them feel small and temporary, the palpable antiquity of the place that seemed to press down on you with the weight of centuries. These things awakened something in the young artist that he had not known existed within him, some deep resonance with the past that would consume him for the rest of his life, becoming his driving passion. He began to study not just to draw, but to genuinely understand what he was seeing and recording, to penetrate beneath the surface to the meaning and the history. He learned Arabic from the local workers and guides, mastering their language and their way of thinking. He learned about Egyptian history and religion and culture from scholars and texts and from walking the land itself. He walked through temples and tombs, observing with intense attention, questioning everything, learning to read the past written in stone and paint and hieroglyphic inscriptions, developing an eye for detail and an archaeological method that would eventually define his entire approach to excavation and would serve as a model for others. He worked for the Egyptian government in various capacities, making sketches and careful plans of monuments that were crumbling and at risk, serving as a draftsman and eventually as an inspector of antiquities responsible for protecting Egypt's heritage. He began to understand the profound complexity of Egyptian archaeology, the layering of history stacked upon itself like pages in a book, the ways in which past and present were constantly intersecting in this land of eternal monuments where the dead seemed to speak to the living. For years, Carter searched with persistence and determination, returning again and again to the valley to pursue his conviction. He walked through the Valley of the Kings, that sacred burial ground where pharaohs had been interred for centuries, their tombs cut into the rock face and decorated with paintings and inscriptions of profound spiritual power. And he asked a question that others had asked before him, but that burned with special intensity in his mind, a question that seemed to consume him. Were there still undiscovered tombs beneath the sand? The valley had been excavated and picked over by various expeditions and scholars, studied by countless people with varying degrees of care and professionalism, and many believed it had been thoroughly explored. Most scholars believed that the major tombs had been found, that the valley had yielded all its secrets and had no more to reveal, that further searching was a waste of time and resources that could be better spent elsewhere. But Carter believed otherwise with an almost stubborn conviction, a belief that seemed almost prophetic in its intensity. He had a hunch, born of careful observation and intuition refined by years of study and reflection, that something remained hidden in the valley, that there were secrets still waiting to be discovered, that the valley still held treasures waiting to be found by someone patient enough and dedicated enough to search. In 1914, Carter entered into a partnership with a man named Lord Carnarvon, a wealthy British aristocrat with the means to fund extensive excavations, a man of considerable wealth and leisure who could afford to pursue his interests with extraordinary generosity and without concern for the expense involved. Carnarvon had come to Egypt initially for his health. The warm climate was thought to ease his respiratory ailments that troubled him in the damp English climate and seemed to worsen with age, and he had become fascinated with Egyptology, drawn irresistibly to the mysteries and monuments of ancient Egypt, to the timeless grandeur of that ancient civilization. He had the money, substantial and seemingly unlimited, the financial resources to undertake ambitious projects, the time free from other responsibilities, and the genuine enthusiasm for the search that would sustain him through years of disappointment. Carter had the knowledge, accumulated over years of patient study in the field, the skill born of decades of experience working in Egypt and learning its secrets, and the unwavering belief that the tomb was there, somewhere beneath the sand and rubble, waiting to be found by someone dedicated enough to search for it. For 7 long years they searched together in the valley, a partnership that would eventually make both men famous, but that was sustained through years of frustration and crushing disappointment, through moments when they must have wondered if they were wasting their time. 7 years of excavation, of moving sand and rubble, of careful systematic work in the sweltering heat of the Egyptian desert, where temperatures could exceed 100 degrees, of living with the gnawing possibility that nothing would be found, that the tomb might not exist. They found fragments, broken objects, evidence of ancient activity scattered through the ages in the sand, but nothing of major significance, nothing that seemed significant enough to justify the years of effort and the considerable expense involved in running such an extended excavation. By 1922, some observers were losing faith in the partnership. Some people in England and Cairo were beginning to question whether Carter and Carnarvon were chasing a phantom, pursuing a dream that had no basis in reality, spending money on an impossible quest. Carnarvon, despite his wealth and his genuine interest in archaeology in Egypt, was beginning to question the investment, wondering if the resources he had poured into the search would ever be rewarded, or if he had simply been wasting his money on the delusions of an obsessed archaeologist. The excavation rights were set to expire, meaning that their legal permission to search would end, and they would need to renegotiate for continued access. Time was running out. The window of opportunity was closing. Unless something was found soon, the search would have to end, and the valley would keep its secrets. Carter did not waver in his conviction, did not let doubt creep into his determination despite the disappointing years that had passed. He asked Carnarvon for one more season, making his case with passion and conviction. Just one more year, he pleaded, one more chance to prove that his belief was justified. He was convinced that the tomb was close, that his calculations about its location were correct based on careful study and observation over years of work, that persistence would be rewarded if they could hold on just a little bit longer, if they could stay the course. Against the advice of some skeptics who thought he was pursuing an obsession rather than serious archaeology, Carnarvon agreed to give Carter one more season, one final opportunity to vindicate his faith, one more year, one more chance to vindicate his belief and his careful study, to prove that his years of work had not been wasted. In November 1922, Carter was working in the valley with a team of local labourers who had worked with him for years and knew his methods intimately, who understood his standards and his expectations for meticulous work. The heat was intense, as it always was in the valley, pressing down on them like an invisible weight that seemed to come from above and below simultaneously. The work was routine, almost mechanical at times. Move sand, sift it carefully through screens to catch anything of significance, document what was found, record everything with meticulous attention to detail so that nothing would be lost to carelessness or forgetfulness. And then, on November 4th, something unexpected happened, something that would change everything, something that would alter the course not just of Carter's life but of archaeology itself. A water boy, a young local boy whose name has been largely forgotten by history, a boy who carried water for the workers to drink to sustain them in the heat, accidentally uncovered a step in the sand. Not a small chip of stone that could be dismissed or overlooked, not an inconsequential fragment that might be natural rather than artificial, but an actual step, a real stair cut from rock with clear intention and purpose, carved by ancient hands with precision and purpose thousands of years before. Carter's heart must have raced, his pulse quickening with sudden recognition and possibility. He understood immediately what this meant, what it portended, what it suggested about what lay beneath the sand. A step meant a structure meant a building, a tomb, something made and intentional. A structure might mean a tomb, and a tomb might mean treasure, might mean the discovery he had been seeking for so long. But he forced himself to remain calm despite the excitement that must have been coursing through him, to work methodically, to follow the discipline and the methods he had developed over years of practice. This was where precision mattered most. This was where the systematic approach that had defined his years in Egypt proved its true worth and value. The team began to excavate carefully around the step, working with deliberation and care to preserve anything that might be found. More steps appeared as they dug, step after step revealing itself beneath the accumulated sand of centuries. 16 steps in total, descending into the earth, forming a staircase that led downward into the darkness beneath the valley floor. And at the bottom of the stairs, at the end of this underground stairway, a sealed doorway. The plaster was intact, undisturbed, unbroken by grave robbers or the centuries. In the plaster, visible to those who knew how to read them, who understood the symbols and the royal language, were seals, the royal cartouches of Tutankhamun, the name impressed into the ancient plaster, preserved perfectly for 3,000 years. Carter's hands trembled as he realized what had been found, what this discovery meant, what it would mean for archaeology, for Egypt, for his own life and future. This was not a robbed tomb, not a burial place that had been violated and emptied by grave robbers in ancient times. The seal suggested that it had been sealed in antiquity and remained undisturbed, untouched, waiting through the ages. This was a discovery of almost incomprehensible significance, a find that would rewrite the history of Egyptian archaeology and make the name of Howard Carter immortal. He knew immediately that this moment would change everything: his life, archaeology itself, the understanding of ancient Egypt that the modern world had developed. But he did not open the tomb immediately, did not yield to the temptation to see what lay beyond that sealed doorway. Instead, he did something that demonstrated the patience and wisdom that had made him a great archaeologist, that showed the discipline that had sustained him through 7 years of searching and disappointment. He sealed the entrance again carefully. He covered the steps to protect them from the elements and from curious eyes. He left the tomb exactly as it had been found, untouched, preserved in the condition in which he had discovered it. And then he sent a telegram to Lord Carnarvon in England. At last have made wonderful discovery in valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact. Congratulations. Carnarvon could not come immediately, could not travel at once despite the excitement of the discovery. He was in England, far from Egypt, separated by thousands of miles of ocean and land. He had to make arrangements, had to close his affairs and prepare for travel, had to make the long journey to Egypt by ship and train, and whatever other means of transportation were available. And so there began a period of agonizing waiting. 3 weeks of waiting. 3 long weeks of anticipation and excitement and uncertainty. 3 weeks during which the greatest intact pharaonic tomb in modern memory sat beneath the sand, untouched, protected only by Carter's vigilance and by the seals of ancient kings that had held fast for 3,000 years, For 3 weeks, the news began to leak out beyond those who were immediately involved, spreading through the small community of Egyptologists and archaeologists who worked in Egypt. Word spread from Cairo to the international press. Newspapers in Cairo and London caught the story and began to print reports. There were rumours of gold, of treasures beyond imagining, of a spectacular discovery that would make headlines around the world. By the time Carnarvon arrived in Egypt, travelling as quickly as the means of transportation available in 1922 would allow, the anticipation had built to an almost unbearable level. Journalists were gathering at the valley, making their way there to cover the story. Crowds were forming, curious onlookers drawn by rumours and reports. The quiet work of archaeology was about to become something far more theatrical, far more public, far more subject to the scrutiny and excitement of the modern world. On November 24th, 1922, Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon stood before the sealed doorway that led into the tomb, facing that ancient barrier between the modern world and the world of the dead. Behind them was a century of archaeological work in the Valley of the Kings, the accumulated knowledge and effort of generations of scholars and excavators who had come before them. Behind them was a lifetime of Carter's dedication, his years of study and searching and careful observation, years that had sustained him through disappointment and criticism. Behind them was the weight of history and the fragility of human memory, the sense that the past was constantly slipping away, that knowledge was being lost forever to time and neglect. And before them was a door that had been sealed 3,000 years ago, a barrier that had held firm through the ages, protecting the secrets that lay beyond, protecting whatever had been left in that underground chamber when the ancient workers sealed it with their rituals and prayers. In that moment, standing before that sealed doorway, Carter must have felt the weight of all his years of work, all the searching and hoping and believing, condensed into this single point in time. All of his certainty, all of his conviction that something remained to be found, all of his faith in his own judgment and calculation, it all came down to this moment, to what lay beyond that sealed barrier. They broke the seal with deliberate care, moving methodically despite the excitement that must have filled them. They descended the 16 steps into the darkness beneath the valley floor, moving carefully through the underground passage, carrying torches and electric lights to illuminate the way, stepping down into the underworld one step at a time. They approached the antechamber of the tomb of Tutankhamun, moving forward into the unknown, crossing the threshold between the known world and something entirely unexpected, something that no living person had seen in 3,000 years. And as they stood on the threshold of that sealed space, entering it for the first time in 3,000 years, feeling the rush of ancient air that had been sealed away since the time of pharaohs, they were about to become witnesses to one of the greatest moments in the history of archaeology, a moment that would echo through the 20th century and beyond, a moment that would make their names immortal and would transform the world's understanding of ancient Egypt and the preservation of the past. On November 26, 1922, Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon entered the antechamber of Tutankhamun's tomb, stepping across a threshold that no living person had crossed in 3,000 years, moving into a space that had been sealed and protected since the time of the pharaohs, since the ancient workers had completed their sacred duties. They were not alone in this moment, for there were others present, Egyptian workers, government officials, other archaeologists and observers. But in that instant, as they crossed the boundary from the modern world into a space that had been sealed for 3,000 years, a space that time seemed to have forgotten and preserved in perfect stasis, the rest of the world seemed to fall away, seemed to become distant and irrelevant and unimportant compared to this moment. The electric light from their torches, powered by 20th century technology, cut through absolute darkness with a sharpness and clarity that was almost shocking, penetrating into a space where no light had entered since the ancient workers sealed the tomb and covered the entrance with sand and rubble, where the darkness had reigned unchallenged for 30 centuries. 3,000 years of undisturbed darkness lay behind them now, pierced suddenly by electric torches, the technology of the 20th century suddenly illuminating objects that had last been seen by human eyes in the 14th century before the Common Era, in the time of pharaohs and priests who lived in a world of beliefs and practices now foreign to the modern mind. As Carter's eyes adjusted to the light, allowing vision to bloom in the darkness like a flower opening to the sun, he saw them everywhere. Objects scattered through the chamber with overwhelming abundance, placed with care and intention by the ancient workers, golden couches with animal heads, magnificent lions and hippopotamuses captured in precious metal, their eyes seemingly watching over the sleeping pharaoh, their forms perfect in every detail, chariots with all their components, their wooden frames intact despite the millennia, their painted surfaces still bearing traces of colour after all the ages that had passed, images that had been fresh and vibrant when Tutankhamun lived. Guardian statues, depicting the pharaoh in formal poses, their faces serene and eternal, fashioned to protect him and accompany him into the afterlife. Chairs and boxes and pieces of furniture crafted with exquisite skill by artisans whose names are now lost to time. Weapons and armour, ceremonial objects, items whose exact purposes were lost to time and cultural change, mysterious reminders of a vanished world. All of it arranged in this underground chamber, as if the owner had just stepped out for a moment and would return at any moment to claim his possessions, as if death had merely paused rather than claimed its final victory. The wealth was staggering, almost incomprehensible in its abundance, a treasury of objects meant to accompany a pharaoh into eternity. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, testifying to the skill and dedication of Egyptian artisans, who laboured to create beauty and precision in every object. But what struck Carter most profoundly, what seemed to hit him with emotional force, was not the abundance or the luxury, not the sheer quantity of objects or their obvious value in material terms. It was the realization that he was looking at the contents of a tomb that had not been disturbed by robbers, that had not been violated by grave looters seeking treasure and leaving destruction, that had been sealed and forgotten and preserved through the ages, held in suspension by time itself, protected from human greed and destructive intent. One story tells of Carter's initial exploration of the chamber, a moment that would become legendary in the history of archaeology and would be repeated countless times in books and articles and conversations about the greatest archaeological discoveries. A colleague standing beside him, standing in the lamplight in that underground space, standing at the threshold of a new understanding of history, asked him the obvious question that anyone would ask in such a moment. "Can you see anything?" Carter's response, spoken in that moment of discovery and wonder, would become one of the most famous quotes in archaeological history, a phrase that would echo through the decades to come, spoken and retold in countless languages and contexts. Yes, wonderful things. Those 3 words, so simple and yet so profound, so perfectly capturing the magnitude of the discovery and the sense of awe and wonder that filled that sealed chamber, would define the moment and would define Carter's life and legacy. They would be quoted in every account of the discovery, would be remembered by everyone who studied Tutankhamun's tomb, would become a kind of shorthand for the entire experience of archaeological discovery. But even as he saw these wonderful things, even as he stood surrounded by treasures that most archaeologists would never see, Carter exercised the discipline that had defined his entire career, the patience and professionalism that had sustained him through years of searching and disappointment. He did not rush forward. He did not grab objects impulsively. He did not remove anything hastily in his excitement and wonder. Instead, he began the painstaking work of documentation, the slow and careful recording of everything he saw. Every object was recorded in writing. Every position was noted on diagrams and maps. Photographs were taken before anything was moved from its original location. The archaeological method that Carter had spent decades developing and perfecting was put into practice at the moment of his greatest triumph, proving that discipline and care matter even more when stakes are highest. The antechamber revealed its contents slowly over days and weeks as the team worked through the chamber with methodical care, handling each object as if it were infinitely precious and irreplaceable, which it was. There were chariots, vehicles of ceremonial and practical importance, their wheels detached and carefully stored against walls or placed in secure storage, their surfaces showing the skill of craftsmen. There were campaign chests and storage boxes of various sizes, some decorated with inscriptions and images that identified their contents or honoured the pharaoh. There were cosmetic containers of remarkable craftsmanship and mirrors of polished metal, and all manner of furniture for daily use and ornament, furniture that would have been familiar and comfortable in the pharaoh's earthly home. There was an ebony-inlaid gaming board, an object of remarkable beauty and technical sophistication, suggesting that in death as in life, the young pharaoh would have diversions and entertainments to occupy his time and his eternity, refusing the assumption that death meant the end of pleasure. There were weapons, swords and shields and spears, though they would never again be used by the boy king who had ruled Egypt, whose brief reign had been devoted to restoration rather than conquest and military glory. There were pieces of artistic beauty crafted for pure aesthetic pleasure, and objects of purely practical function meant to serve concrete purposes, all arranged together in this underground sanctuary that seemed to exist outside of time. But the antechamber was not the end of the tomb, not the final chamber, not the deepest secret. As Carter and his team worked methodically through the chamber, as they recorded and carefully removed objects, they discovered another sealed doorway, another barrier between the modern world and the ancient past. Beyond the antechamber, there was more waiting to be discovered. The possibility of additional chambers began to suggest itself, perhaps chambers that would contain the burial place of the pharaoh himself, the innermost sanctum where Tutankhamun's mummy rested in eternal sleep, protected by spells and seals and the weight of centuries. The realization began to dawn on Carter, and on all those who understood the significance. This was not just a single chamber that had been sealed for 3,000 years and then forgotten. This was a complex of rooms, an entire network of chambers, a miniature palace built beneath the earth, a complete home prepared for the afterlife. The antechamber alone contained treasures that would occupy archaeologists and museum curators for decades to come, items that would require years of study and careful analysis. But there was more waiting to be discovered beyond that sealed doorway, more mysteries waiting in the darkness, more secrets that had been preserved through the ages. The physical act of entering the tomb had been easy enough, almost simple in its execution, requiring only courage and determination and careful planning. But the work of excavation that would follow proved far more complex and challenging than anyone had anticipated, far more demanding in terms of technical skill and archaeological knowledge. There were practical challenges that seemed almost overwhelming to contemplate. How do you remove fragile objects that have sat untouched for 3,000 years without damaging them, without causing them to crumble or break? How do you preserve objects that have been in stasis for millennia and then suddenly exposed to changing conditions of temperature, humidity, and light? How do you ensure that in the process of bringing these treasures to light, you do not destroy them in the process of saving them? The air itself had been sealed, preserved in a kind of stasis, unchanged since the day the tomb was sealed by ancient workers, holding the same composition for 3,000 years. The moment the tomb was opened, the moment fresh air entered that sealed space, the air itself began to change irreversibly. Humidity started to affect the objects, moisture beginning to interact with materials that had been protected from it, beginning the process of chemical change. Chemical processes began to occur in response to the changed conditions, oxidation, and other reactions set in motion by the introduction of new elements from the outside world. The very act of opening the tomb to the modern world set in motion processes of decay and change that had been halted since the day it was sealed, that had been paused and frozen for 3,000 years. Carter approached this challenge with the care of a master craftsman, with the precision of someone who understood that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that could never be repeated or recovered if mistakes were made. Nothing could be moved until it was photographed and documented with extreme care. Nothing could be removed from the antechamber until its exact position and its relationship to all other objects had been recorded in detail. The work would take months, stretching into seasons. The excavation of the antechamber alone would take nearly a year, a full year of careful, methodical work, demonstrating the patience required for true archaeological precision. As the contents were revealed and carefully removed, placed in temporary storage, and eventually transported to museums and research facilities where they could be properly studied and preserved, a rich and detailed picture of ancient royal life began to emerge from the objects themselves, telling stories about beliefs and values and daily practices. There were provisions for the journey to the afterlife, food preserved in sealed containers to sustain the pharaoh through eternity, drink in sealed jars, tools and utensils for everyday use, weapons for protection, all the things that an ancient Egyptian would believe necessary for the transition into the next realm of existence. There were objects for entertainment and amusement, games and gaming pieces suggesting leisure and pleasure, musical instruments that would have produced beautiful sounds, toys and diversions that suggested the Egyptians did not view death as an end but as a transition, a journey to another realm where the pharaoh would need the same comforts and amusements that he had enjoyed in his earthly life. If you're using this to help you relax and fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos, to create a space for peace and contemplation in a busy world. Maybe drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I always love hearing from the Calm Archive community. The Calm Archive community stretches across every time zone, and it's wonderful to see people from all over the world, all finding peace and tranquility in these ancient stories just hours apart from one another. Anyway, back to the tomb. But beyond the practical contents of the chamber, beyond the tools and provisions and everyday items, there was also the artistic testimony, the evidence of human creativity and skill at work over millennia before. The funerary furniture was exquisite beyond description, each piece a masterwork of design and construction, created by artisans who took pride in their work. The chariots showed the skill of Egyptian craftsmen at the height of their abilities, their technical knowledge refined through generations of practice, and their artistic sensibility combined in perfect harmony, creating objects that were both functionally sophisticated and aesthetically beautiful. The golden items testified to the wealth and power of the Egyptian state, to the vast resources at the disposal of the pharaohs and their courts, to the capability of the civilization to command such treasures. And yet, knowing what we know now about Tutankhamun, that he was a relatively minor pharaoh in the grand scheme of Egyptian history, that his reign was relatively brief and unremarkable by the standards of major pharaohs, that he died young at the age of 19 and became famous only because his tomb happened to survive undisturbed. The abundance and the care taken in his burial seems almost poignant and touching in its implications. A boy king, a young man who had never accomplished great military victories or public works, had been given a treasury to take with him into death, had been honoured with all the ceremonial and material wealth that Egypt could provide, treated with the respect and reverence reserved for the greatest and most powerful of pharaohs. 3,000 years of separation had been bridged in that single moment of discovery and opening. The objects that had been carefully placed in this chamber to sustain the pharaoh in the afterlife were now speaking to a world that could barely comprehend the civilization that had created them, that could hardly fathom the beliefs and values and spiritual understanding that had motivated the creation of such treasures and such care in preservation. These were not objects from some distant legendary past, from the realm of myth and fable and stories no longer connected to reality. These were things made by human hands, created by artisans and craftspeople whose dedication to their work was evident in every detail, arranged by human care and intention, with reverence for the dead, sealed away by human command to protect the pharaoh's eternal rest. And now, because a water boy had accidentally uncovered a single step in the sand while digging, they were about to be revealed to the modern world, about to become ambassadors from the ancient past to the contemporary age, speaking across the vast gulf of time. The work continued methodically, day after day, week after week as the seasons changed above in the valley. The antechamber slowly surrendered its secrets to the patient work of archaeologists and conservators who treated each object with reverence and care. The news of the discovery spread through newspapers around the world, and Tutankhamun's name began to emerge from the obscurity of 3,000 years to become known to millions of people who had never heard of him before. The objects from his tomb would eventually find their way to museums and research institutions, would be studied and analysed by scholars, would inspire thousands of people to become interested in ancient Egypt, in archaeology, in the preservation of the past. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb would become one of the most significant archaeological finds of the 20th century, a discovery that would reshape how people understood ancient Egypt and how they thought about the possibilities of archaeology. And beyond the antechamber, sealed behind another doorway, awaited the burial chamber itself, the inner sanctum where the pharaoh's mummy rested in its golden coffin, waiting to meet the modern world after 30 centuries of undisturbed peace, after 3,000 years of being alone in that sealed underground world. That burial chamber held secrets of its own, wonders that would astound even those who had already been amazed by the antechamber. The massive golden shrine that dominated the burial chamber, the artistic treasures, the sacred objects, all of it would eventually be revealed to the modern world, adding layer upon layer to the understanding of how the ancient Egyptians prepared their pharaohs for the eternal journey. And in all of this, in the treasures and the artistry and the careful craftsmanship, we can see the reflection of an entire civilization, its values and its beliefs, its understanding of death and eternity, its dedication to preserving the memory and the dignity of its rulers. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb reminds us that the past is never truly lost, that it waits beneath the sand and the dust for those patient and dedicated enough to search for it, that even after thousands of years, human creativity and human intention can survive and speak to us across the ages. Deep within the Valley of the Kings, entombed in stone and shadow for more than 3,000 years, there exists a space so small, so intimate, that it feels almost as though we are stepping into the inner sanctum of a teenager's most private dreams. This is the burial chamber of Tutankhamun, a pharaoh who never lived to see his 20th year, yet whose final resting place has become one of the most profound expressions of human longing for permanence and remembrance that our civilization has ever created. As we descend through the corridors of time and stone, imagine yourself moving deeper and deeper, past the antechamber with its jumbled treasures, past the threshold where Howard Carter first peered by candlelight with a trembling hand, and into the chamber itself, where the air itself seems to hold its breath across the centuries, where time has become something tangible and present and utterly still. What greets you is not a vast cathedral or a sprawling palace, but something far more intimate and therefore far more moving, a room that is almost entirely consumed by 4 nested golden shrines, each one fitted inside the last like Russian dolls, like boxes of dreams within dreams, like the protective layers of memory surrounding a precious heart. These shrines do not sit alone on the floor but fill nearly the entire burial chamber, leaving only a narrow corridor around their perimeter through which a single person might walk with arms outstretched, fingertips almost brushing the walls on both sides, and in this tight space you can feel the weight of intention, the deliberate construction of a protective architecture that was meant to endure forever. They are monuments to redundancy, to the ancient Egyptian belief that layer upon layer of protection, of sacred geometry, of precious metal and sacred words might somehow hold back the inevitable passage of time and the dissolution that awaits all earthly things. The shrines themselves were constructed with extraordinary precision, fitted together so seamlessly that it is difficult to see where one ends and another begins, each one a perfect replica of the last at a different scale, each one covered not merely with gold but with hieroglyphic inscriptions and divine images, with representations of gods and sacred words and prayers carved or painted or inlaid into every surface, creating a kind of 3-dimensional sacred text that surrounded the pharaoh on all sides. Within these 4 golden shrines, like a secret held within a secret, like the most intimate thought buried beneath layers of consciousness, rests a sarcophagus carved from a single block of quartzite, a stone of such profound hardness and resistance that it seems almost a physical manifestation of the desire to endure eternally. The quartzite glows with a pale, ghostly luminescence when imagined in the darkness, a stone that has witnessed geological ages and seems to contain within itself the memory of mountains and epochs, and the slow pressure of the earth accumulating its weight across millions of years. And yet even this fortress of stone was understood to be insufficient by the ancient priests who prepared this tomb, for within the sarcophagus itself were placed 3 coffins, nested one within the other, each one progressively more precious, more sacred, more profoundly human in its intention and its craftsmanship. The outer 2 coffins were fashioned from gilded wood, their surfaces covered in hieroglyphic texts and images of the gods who would protect and guide the soul of the young pharaoh, their shapes formed to the precise contours of a human body wrapped in burial cloth, so that each coffin was a kind of gilded mummy in itself, a mirror of the body it contained. But the innermost coffin, the one closest to the flesh and bone of the pharaoh himself, to the very molecules of his being, was fashioned from solid gold, pure and unalloyed, a coffin so heavy, so dense with precious material that it weighs 243 pounds, or 110 kilograms, a weight that seems to exist in the realm of the almost unimaginable, a weight that transforms the simple act of lying down into a kind of geological commitment, a merging with the substance of the earth itself and the timeless treasures hidden within it. This innermost coffin, shaped precisely to the form of the young king, represents perhaps the ultimate expression of the human desire to preserve ourselves, to encircle our mortality with beauty and weight and permanence and gold. And resting upon the breast of this golden coffin, catching the light with an almost supernatural radiance that seems to come from somewhere beyond mere reflection, is perhaps the single most famous artifact in the entire world, an object that has captured the imagination and the heart of every person who has ever gazed upon its likeness, the golden death mask of Tutankhamun. This mask, fashioned from a single sheet of solid gold that has been so expertly worked that it seems impossibly thin and impossibly durable simultaneously, weighs 24 pounds of pure precious metal and represents a face that is simultaneously ancient and eternally young, simultaneously the face of a distant king and the face of a person we feel we might know and recognize, might pass on the street and think we recognize from somewhere long ago. The mask is inlaid with stones of profound beauty and symbolic weight. Lapis lazuli of a blue so deep it seems to contain the entire night sky within its mineral structure, carnelian of a warm red-orange that speaks of life and fire and the rising sun, obsidian of a black so pure it seems to contain infinity itself, and turquoise of a blue-green that holds the memory of water and sky, and the precious stones that decorated palaces and temples across the ancient world. The expression of this face, with its serene and almost otherworldly calm, with its almond-shaped eyes gazing toward eternity, with its perfect features rendered in precious metal, as though captured at the moment of deepest peace, seems to look directly into your own eyes across the 3,300 years that separate his death from this moment, and in that gaze you feel something transcendent and deeply moving. The presence of a person, not merely an artifact or a museum piece, but the captured countenance of a teenager who died 33 centuries ago, yet whose face has somehow become known to more people, seen by more eyes, treasured by more hearts, than perhaps any other face in human history. A face that has become a kind of universal symbol for the mysteries of ancient Egypt and the mysteries of mortality itself. Beneath this mask, beneath the layers of gold and sacred wrappings, beneath the carefully arranged amulets and protective charms, lies the mummy itself, and modern science, with its gentle and non-invasive techniques of computed tomography and careful analysis, has revealed to us the physical reality of the person who wore this golden disguise. Through the careful application of CT scans and expert examination, researchers have determined that Tutankhamun was a young man of approximately 19 years of age at the time of his death, a teenager still, someone who had scarcely reached adulthood before the mystery of death took him from the world, and that his body bore the marks of the hardships of life in the ancient world, even for a king who lived in unimaginable luxury and power, surrounded by servants and surrounded by the wealth of an entire nation. There was a break in his leg, evidence of an injury that may have caused him pain or restricted his mobility in his final days or months, injury that perhaps contributed to his vulnerability, that perhaps weakened him in ways that made him susceptible to other afflictions. There were also traces of malaria within his system, the parasitic disease that has plagued humanity across epochs and continents, bringing fever and weakness, and the weakness that comes from the body at war with itself, from the immune system struggling against an invader that cannot be seen or easily understood. And there were genetic conditions visible in his skeletal structure, the evidence of inbreeding within the royal family, a practice that was sometimes engaged in to preserve the purity of the royal line, but which carried with it the genetic consequences that modern medicine has come to understand so well. Genetic consequences that manifested in subtle but significant ways throughout his body. These findings transformed Tutankhamun from an abstract historical figure into a person who suffered, who experienced pain and illness, who was vulnerable despite his station, who was mortal despite his divinity in the eyes of his people, who was simply a teenager struggling with the afflictions and the accident of his young body. And this transformation somehow makes him feel closer to us, more real, more intimately known, more like someone whose life and death we might actually understand. Beyond the burial chamber itself, accessible through a doorway that guards the threshold between the world of the living and the world of the dead, lies the treasury room, a space filled with objects of such profundity and beauty that the mind can scarcely encompass them all at once. Here, arranged in solemn order according to ancient principles of organization and meaning, are the objects that the ancient Egyptians believed the pharaoh would need in the afterlife, everything required for the continuation of existence and the navigation of the spiritual journey that awaited him. The canopic shrine, an exquisite structure of stunning craftsmanship, housing miniature golden coffins containing the king's organs, each organ protected in its own small sarcophagus, each organ carefully mummified and consecrated according to the elaborate theological system that governed the journey to the afterlife. Here too stands a golden shrine dedicated to Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification and the guardian of the dead, a figure both fearsome and protective, both a reminder of mortality and a promise of eternal preservation and safekeeping, rendered in gold with an expression of solemn watchfulness, as though this golden god would never sleep, would never stop guarding the sacred space around the pharaoh. In total, the tomb contained over 5,000 objects, each one carefully chosen and placed, each one a kind of prayer or promise or remembrance, each one contributing to an overall tapestry of intention and hope that is almost impossible to fully absorb or comprehend. 5,000 separate objects, each with its own purpose, each with its own place in the complex spiritual architecture of the afterlife. And yet what strikes the modern viewer most profoundly, what somehow pierces through the gold and the grandeur and the overwhelming abundance of precious things, is the presence of intimate personal items, objects so achingly human in their ordinariness that they seem to speak directly across the millennia to our own hearts and our own understanding of what it means to be human, what it means to be loved, what it means to want to preserve something or someone. There are sandals, simple shoes worn on the feet of a teenage king as he walked through the corridors of his palace, now preserved and golden, yet fundamentally unchanged in their purpose and their form, still shaped to the curve of feet long turned to dust. There are board games, evidence that this young pharaoh, despite his absolute power and divine status, still felt the need for entertainment and leisure, still wanted to challenge his mind and pass his time in ways that we ourselves would recognize and understand, games that connected him to thousands of years of human tradition and entertainment. There is a child's chair, a smaller throne meant for sitting, a heartbreaking reminder that this king who inherited the burden of an entire civilization was still, in some fundamental way, a child. Someone who had not fully grown into his role, someone who was still becoming the person he might have been, had fate allowed him more time. A chair that speaks to the vulnerability and the youth that lay behind the golden mask and the pharaonic titles. There are flower garlands, withered now and fragile, yet still retaining their form and something of their delicate beauty. Flowers that were woven and arranged with care by hands long turned to dust, perhaps presented as gifts or offerings at ceremonies that took place millennia ago. Flowers that someone thought beautiful enough to preserve in the tomb, that someone loved enough to want to endure forever. Flowers that suggest an act of tenderness in the midst of ritual and formality. These objects, in their ordinariness and their preciousness, in their combination of the everyday and the eternal, in their suggestion of a life lived and a person loved, transform the tomb from a mere repository of treasure into a kind of intimate autobiography, a narrative written not in words but in objects, telling us not merely about a king, but about a person, about the hopes of those who loved him, about the universal human desire to be remembered, to be cherished, to have our most precious moments and most beloved possessions endure beyond the grasp of time itself. And as you lie here in the darkness, listening to these words drift through your consciousness, like the air moving through an ancient burial chamber, allow yourself to feel the presence of this teenager who lived so long ago, who died so young, yet whose life and whose death and whose carefully preserved memory continue to speak to us, continue to move us, continue to remind us of the profound and enduring human need to create beauty and meaning even in the face of mortality and the inevitable passage of time. The sandals themselves were crafted from woven reeds and delicate leather, materials that should have crumbled to dust millennia ago, yet which were preserved by the dry desert air and the sealed chamber, preserving them in a state of remarkable completeness, preserving not just the object, but the relationship between the object and the person who wore it, preserving evidence of the human feet that once touched these surfaces. The board games, particularly the Senet game that was found in the tomb, speak to something deeply universal in human nature, the desire to play, to compete, to engage in entertainment and leisure, even when burdened with the weight of kingship and the responsibilities of ruling an entire nation. The ancient Egyptians believed that the dead played Senet in the afterlife, that games continued in the world beyond death, that entertainment and leisure and the simple pleasures of play were not diminished by mortality, but continued eternally in the realm of the gods and the dead. The child's chair is perhaps the most poignant of all these objects, a small throne that would have fit a very young boy, a piece of furniture that speaks to the childhood of the pharaoh, that speaks to the time before he inherited the full weight of responsibility, that speaks to innocence and youth, and the passage from childhood to adulthood that Tutankhamun never fully completed. The flower garlands are perhaps the most fragile of all these intimate objects, the most vulnerable to decay and destruction, yet miraculously they survived, preserved for 3,000 years, flowers woven and woven together in patterns and arrangements that suggest care and attention and love. The flowers themselves have been identified as blue lotus flowers and cornflowers, flowers that bloomed in the Nile Valley, flowers that carried symbolic significance in ancient Egyptian culture, flowers that represented beauty and life and the cycle of seasons and renewal. That someone took the time to weave these flowers together, to arrange them with care, to place them on the mummy of the young pharaoh, speaks to the emotional reality of his death, speaks to grief and loss and the human need to honour and remember those we have loved, even those who were pharaohs, even those who were divine in the eyes of their people. The presence of these flowers suggests that Tutankhamun was not merely a political symbol, not merely a representative of pharaonic power, but a person who was loved, a teenager who inspired affection and care and genuine human emotion in those around him, people who were willing to preserve flowers that would have been beautiful for only a brief moment, willing to include these fragile beauty in the tomb in hopes that they would somehow endure forever. And miraculously, almost impossibly, they did endure. The flowers have survived 3,000 years, preserved by the dry desert air, preserved by the sealed chamber, preserved by the extraordinary circumstance that allowed so much of this tomb to remain intact and essentially unchanged. Looking at these flowers, handling them carefully in modern museums or imagining their presence in the tomb, we can almost feel the hands of the ancient priests who placed them there, almost feel their emotion, their grief, their desire to honour the young pharaoh one final time with beauty and with flowers that represented life and renewal in the ancient Egyptian spiritual system. Through these intimate objects, through these personal items that were placed in the tomb, alongside the treasures of gold and the sacred shrines, and all the elaborate religious apparatus of ancient Egyptian burial practice, we come to understand not just how the ancient Egyptians buried their dead, not just the religious beliefs and theological systems that governed their approach to death and the afterlife, but how they loved, how they grieved, how they expressed emotion and affection even in the presence of elaborate ritual and formal religious procedures. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb set off a phenomenon that would define the 20th century's relationship with ancient Egypt, a wave of fascination and media attention, unlike anything the world of archaeology had ever witnessed before, a tsunami of public interest that swept across continents and generations. The media frenzy that followed was unprecedented in the history of archaeology, and perhaps in the history of human discovery itself, spreading with the speed of electricity through telegraph wires and newspaper pages and the nascent technologies of mass communication that were just beginning to connect the world. Newspapers around the world carried the story on their front pages, competing with each other to produce more sensational headlines, more spectacular photographs. Photographs of the treasures circulated globally, travelling by ship and rail, reaching audiences in distant cities who had never thought much about ancient Egypt before, but who found themselves captivated by these golden images. The image of the golden mask appeared in publications from London to New York to Tokyo, appearing in magazines and newspapers and even on postcards that people collected and shared, becoming almost instantly iconic, almost instantly familiar. A discovery that had occurred in the desert tomb of a minor pharaoh, a relatively obscure ruler who had lived in the shadows of greater predecessors, became a worldwide sensation overnight, transforming Howard Carter from an archaeologist into a celebrity, making Tutankhamun more famous in death than he had ever been in life. Part of this overwhelming sensation was fueled by a narrative that emerged almost immediately after the discovery, a story that captured the imagination with an almost supernatural power. The Curse of the Pharaoh, a tale of ancient magic and supernatural retribution that spoke to something deep in the human consciousness, something beyond rational explanation. The story took hold in the public imagination with remarkable speed, spreading faster than the truth, taking on a life of its own, becoming part of the cultural consciousness as surely as the artifacts themselves. There were supposed ancient inscriptions warning of death to those who disturbed the tomb, dramatic curses inscribed on walls and sealed chambers, threats of supernatural vengeance written in hieroglyphics, though later investigation could find no evidence of any such inscriptions, no archaeological proof that such warnings had ever existed. But the narrative was too compelling to require evidence, too powerful to be undermined by mere facts or by the absence of ancient curses. Death, it was said, awaited those who violated the sacred space, those who had the temerity to open a tomb that had been sealed for thousands of years, those who dared to disturb the eternal sleep of a pharaoh, and this narrative of death and divine retribution resonated deeply with audiences who were perhaps frightened by the rapid pace of modern change, who were perhaps anxious about the implications of science and exploration and the disturbance of ancient mysteries. The curse found its first victim, allegedly, when Lord Carnarvon became seriously ill in early 1923, the same man who had funded the excavation, who had contributed the resources that made the discovery possible. He had cut his chin while shaving, a mundane accident in a wealthy man's morning routine, and had become infected with pneumonia, the same disease that killed thousands of people every year in an era before antibiotics, before modern medicine had developed the tools to fight bacterial infections effectively. On April 5th, 1923, approximately 5 months after opening the tomb, after the initial excitement had begun to settle into quieter scholarly work, Lord Carnarvon died, his body succumbing to the infection that his immune system could not overcome. He was 67 years old, an elderly man by the standards of the time, someone whose health had been fragile and whose constitution had always been somewhat delicate. His death might have been entirely unremarkable in ordinary circumstances. Elderly men in 1923 died of pneumonia all the time. It was a common cause of death, the old man's friend, as doctors sometimes called it, a relatively quick way to go when antibiotics did not exist. But in the context of the tomb discovery, his death became something far more dramatic and far more mythic. The press seized on the story with an almost frenzied enthusiasm, sensing a narrative that would capture public attention far more effectively than mere archaeological details ever could. The curse of the pharaoh had claimed its first victim. They reported in bold headlines the ancient magic had reached out across the millennia and struck down the man who had dared to disturb the sacred tomb. The newspapers made the narrative irresistible, so powerful and so compelling that it seemed to overwhelm the mundane truth of medical reality. Carnarvon had violated a sacred tomb, had ordered the opening of a burial chamber that had been sealed by divine will, and now he had paid the price, struck down by supernatural forces that could not be defied or negotiated with or understood through the lens of modern science. But the curse narrative was more complex and stranger than a simple cautionary tale of divine retribution, taking on additional layers and additional victims as the years progressed. Various deaths in the following years were attributed to the curse, each one adding to the narrative, each one providing additional evidence for those who believed in the supernatural nature of the tomb's protection. Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, a radiologist who had x-rayed the mummy in order to study its internal structure, died in December 1923, just months after the initial investigation. Howard Bethel, a member of the excavation team, died in 1924, his life cut short. His death added to the growing tally of the curse's victims. Others who had been associated with the discovery died in the years that followed, and each death was added to the accounting. Each death became another piece of evidence in an ever-growing body of documentation of the curse's power and reach. The press attributed each death to the curse with an almost gleeful enthusiasm, seeing in each passing a confirmation of the supernatural narrative that had captured the public imagination so thoroughly. A narrative of supernatural retribution took hold in the popular imagination, spreading through newspapers and magazines, through conversations in drawing rooms and sitting rooms and cafes, through the mass culture that was beginning to form in the early 20th century, and this narrative of death and divine retribution became more real to many people than the actual facts of the matter. Yet the rational examination of these deaths tells a different story, a story grounded in the mundane realities of human health and mortality and the state of medical knowledge in the 1920s. Most of those who died had been ill before the tomb opening, or were elderly when they died, or had other explanations for their deaths that had nothing to do with supernatural curses. Pneumonia and other infectious diseases were significant killers in 1923 and the years that followed, particularly affecting the elderly and the infirm, the weak and the vulnerable who had no defense against bacterial infection. Archibald Reed was already suffering from various ailments before his death, his body weakened by years of exposure to X-rays, his health already compromised by conditions unrelated to any curse. The deaths, in other words, were explainable through natural causes, through the ordinary ailments that affected human beings and caused them to pass from life into death with regularity and predictability. But the curse narrative was far more compelling than the mundane reality of early 20th century medicine and human mortality, far more interesting than the simple facts of aging and disease and the fragility of the human body in an era before modern medical science had developed the tools to combat infection and illness. What did seem to cause actual problems was the biological environment of the tomb itself, the real and tangible dangers that existed in the sealed chamber, dangers that had nothing to do with magic or with curses or with the supernatural. The sealed space had harboured mould and bacteria for 3,000 years, accumulating in the darkness, growing and multiplying and developing in the airless chamber, creating a kind of biological time capsule of ancient microorganisms and decomposition byproducts. As the tomb was opened and exposed to the modern world, as fresh air and sunlight and human presence entered for the first time in 3 millennia, these microorganisms began to spread, releasing spores into the air, disturbing the equilibrium that had existed in the sealed space. Some members of the excavation team did develop respiratory infections and other illnesses, their bodies reacting to the inhalation of spores and bacterial material that had been sealed in the tomb for thousands of years, though these illnesses could be attributed to the mold spores and bacterial contamination, rather than to supernatural curses or to divine retribution. The tomb was dangerous in real biological ways that had nothing to do with pharaonic magic and everything to do with the chemistry of 3,000 years of sealed decay, with the accumulation of organic matter and the growth of microorganisms in an airless chamber, with the simple facts of microbiology and the realities of a sealed space that had been isolated from the outside world for so long. Yet through all the chaos and media frenzy and the sensationalism that surrounded the discovery, Howard Carter himself did not die, a fact that should have undermined the entire curse narrative but which somehow did not. While others allegedly fell victim to the supernatural retribution of the curse, Carter lived, continuing his archaeological work, continuing to document and study the treasures that had been discovered in the tomb. He was the primary focus of the supposed curse, the man who had opened the tomb, who had made the initial discoveries, who had taken the first candle into the burial chamber and gasped at what he saw, the man who had breached the sacred seal that had protected the pharaoh's sleep for 3,000 years. Yet he lived to be 64 years old, dying in 1939, long after the curse's supposed power should have struck him down, long after he should have been claimed by supernatural forces if such forces existed. This inconvenient truth somewhat undermined the curse narrative, this stubborn refusal of the man who had most obviously violated the tomb to succumb to the promised supernatural retribution. Yet the curse legend persisted in public imagination, sustained by repetition and emotional power, and the human need for mystery and supernatural explanation. The reality of Carter's long life after the discovery could not compete with the appeal of a story of supernatural retribution, could not overcome the emotional and narrative power of the curse narrative that had captured the public imagination so thoroughly. But the curse was only one aspect of the phenomenon that followed the discovery, only one layer of the complex cultural response to the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb. The tomb sparked what became known as Tutmania, a fever of interest in ancient Egypt and its artifacts, a wave of fascination that swept through Western culture and transformed the way people thought about ancient civilizations and ancient history. Egyptian-inspired art and design became fashionable, appearing in homes and galleries and public spaces, reflecting the newfound fascination with ancient Egypt that had been sparked by the tomb discovery. The Art Deco movement, which was already emerging in the 1920s as a major artistic force, incorporated Egyptian motifs and aesthetics into its designs, drawing inspiration from the geometric forms and the symbolic imagery that characterized ancient Egyptian art. Women's fashion began to reflect Egyptian influences, with clothing and jewellery incorporating hieroglyphic motifs and Egyptian imagery, with hairstyles and makeup inspired by the appearance of Egyptian nobility. Museums around the world found that their Egyptian collections attracted unprecedented crowds, that visitors who had previously shown little interest in ancient Egypt now came in throngs to see the artifacts, to gaze upon objects that had been made thousands of years ago, to connect somehow with the ancient world that had been brought suddenly and dramatically into the public consciousness. The young pharaoh, dead for 3,000 years, had become a cultural icon, his image and his treasures transformed into symbols of mystery and beauty, and the enduring human fascination with death and eternity, and the preservation of the human form. Beneath this popular enthusiasm, however, were more serious and more complex issues at stake, issues that would shape the relationship between Egypt and the Western world for generations to come. Egypt was a politically complex space in the 1920s, a nation that was nominally independent but which still remained under significant British influence and control, a colonial territory struggling for full autonomy and self-determination. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb occurred during a period of rising Egyptian nationalism, during a time when Egyptians were increasingly questioning the relationship with Britain and increasingly demanding that Egypt's treasures and Egypt's heritage be preserved within Egypt itself rather than shipped off to distant museums in London or Paris or Berlin. Who had the right to Egypt's treasures? This question became increasingly urgent and increasingly divisive. The question of whether these objects should remain in Egypt or be distributed to museums around the world, whether Egyptians should control their own cultural heritage, or whether Western institutions should be allowed to claim these treasures as part of their collections. Should they remain in Egypt to be displayed in Egyptian museums, telling Egypt's own story to its own people, preserving Egypt's cultural memory and historical narrative within its own borders? Or should they be removed to foreign museums, particularly to British and European institutions, where they could be studied and displayed to international audiences, where Western scholars could examine them and Western visitors could gaze upon them without travelling to Egypt itself? Howard Carter found himself at the centre of these political tensions, caught between his desire to study and preserve the artefacts and the increasingly forceful demands of Egyptian authorities for control of the treasures. The Egyptian authorities were eager to retain control of the treasures, were increasingly insistent that Egypt's heritage should not be scattered to the corners of the world, but should remain in Egypt where it could tell Egypt's story and connect Egyptians to their glorious past. There were disputes about who had excavation rights, about how the objects should be divided between the Egyptian government and the foreign team, about whether all of Tutankhamun's treasures should remain in Egypt, or whether some should be permitted to travel to foreign museums for display and study and scholarly examination. Carter fought with Egyptian officials, negotiating and arguing, and attempting to preserve the integrity of the excavation in the face of increasing political pressure and increasingly hostile relationships with the Egyptian authorities. There were threats and counter-threats, tensions escalating, relationships deteriorating, and the excavation itself became deeply political, no longer a matter of pure archaeological interest but a battle for control over Egypt's cultural heritage and Egypt's past. What might have been a purely archaeological endeavour, a scholarly investigation into the material remains of ancient Egypt, became embroiled in questions of colonialism and imperialism and national identity and cultural ownership, questions that were much larger than any single tomb or any single collection of artefacts. The tombs of Egypt's pharaohs belonged to Egypt, many argued, belonged to the Egyptian people and the Egyptian nation, and they should not be scattered to the corners of the world where they would be separated from their cultural context and their historical meaning. They should tell their story in the land where they were created, in the landscape where the pharaohs had lived and ruled, in the museums where Egyptians could see their own history and connect with their glorious past. This sentiment, which seems obvious and natural to modern sensibilities, was relatively progressive in the 1920s, when the cultural artifacts of colonized nations were routinely removed to European and American museums, when Western institutions assumed the right to collect and display the treasures of other cultures, when questions of cultural ownership and cultural heritage were not yet central to discussions of archaeology and museum practice. Carter died in 1939, just as the world was sliding toward another global conflict, just as Europe was preparing for a war that would consume the continent and reshape world politics for generations. He did not live to see how his discovery would be debated and discussed for decades, how the question of cultural ownership would become increasingly urgent, how the legacy of the tomb discovery would extend far beyond the realm of archaeology into questions of national identity and cultural rights. But his careful excavation, his methodical documentation of every object and every context, his respect for the objects themselves and for the context in which they had been placed, these established a standard for archaeological work that would define the discipline for generations, that would influence how archaeologists approach their work, that would shape the practice of archaeology for decades to come. The legacy of the discovery extended far beyond museums and scholarship. beyond the realm of academic study and professional archaeology. The young pharaoh, Tutankhamun, who had been almost forgotten in his own time, whose name had been erased from official king lists by pharaohs who came after him, whose reign had been marked as a transitional period between greater pharaohs and greater dynasties, had become the most famous pharaoh in the world, more famous than Ramesses, more famous than Khufu, more famous than any other pharaoh who had ruled Egypt in any era. The very obscurity of his historical importance, the relative insignificance of his reign and his accomplishments, made his tomb significant in ways that would not have been true for a more important pharaoh. The very fact that a minor ruler's burial chamber contained such overwhelming riches suggested the question: what treasures must the tombs of greater pharaohs have contained? What wealth and what artifacts must have been buried with the greatest and most powerful rulers of Egypt? The answer was that most of those tombs had been robbed or destroyed in antiquity, plundered by thieves in the centuries after the pharaohs died, destroyed by earthquakes or floods or the passage of time and the inevitable decay that affects all human creations. Tutankhamun's tomb, through an accident of history and geography, through the chance positioning of his burial chamber and the particular geological circumstances that protected it, through circumstances that had nothing to do with the power or the importance of the pharaoh himself, had been the one that survived, the one tomb that remained largely intact, the one collection of treasures that had been preserved for 3,000 years and that emerged into the modern world still carrying the weight and the mystery and the beauty of ancient Egypt. If you're still awake, you're doing great. Subscribe to the Calm Archive if you haven't already. A new sleep story arrives every single day. Now, let's drift deeper into the ancient world. The ancient Egyptians understood something profound about the human experience, something that modern minds often overlook in their haste and certainty, their tendency to deny what cannot be measured or controlled. They knew that death was not an ending but a transformation, a doorway through which the soul passes into another realm of existence, and they prepared for this journey with meticulous care and reverent devotion that shaped their entire civilization. Close your eyes and imagine yourself standing at the edge of the Nile at twilight, the great river that gave life to their civilization, and as the sun sets beyond the western horizon, in colours of burnished gold and deep crimson, you begin to understand their perspective on mortality and eternity. The West was death, yes, but also rebirth, regeneration, the home of Osiris and the field of reeds. The Duat, the Egyptian underworld, was not a place of punishment or torment as later cultures imagined it to be. Rather, it was a landscape that the soul must navigate with courage and wisdom, a terrain filled with both obstacles and opportunities, challenges and wonders, and the ancient Egyptians spent their entire lives preparing mentally and spiritually for this crucial passage that would come to every human being without exception. They saw in death not failure or tragedy, but the ultimate initiation, the final examination that would determine whether the soul had lived according to the cosmic principles of Mayat, truth and justice and right order. The Book of the Dead, that magnificent collection of spells and instructions that has survived thousands of years in tombs and temple walls, was truly a comprehensive guidebook for the afterlife journey. Imagine holding this sacred text in your hands, these papyrus scrolls inscribed with hieroglyphic wisdom rendered by skilled scribes, each spell a map, each instruction a compass point for the soul travelling through unknown and dangerous dimensions, through realms where normal rules did not apply and transformation was constant. These were not prayers written in fear but affirmations spoken in hope and absolute confidence. The deceased would need to know the names of the gatekeepers who guarded each threshold, the passwords and secret knowledge to speak at each portal, the formulas to transform themselves into different forms as needed, perhaps becoming a phoenix or a serpent or a beam of light itself, perhaps flying like a bird or swimming like a fish through celestial waters. The spells provided practical knowledge for a journey that the Egyptians believed was as real and tangible as any voyage across the desert, with its scorching sands and hidden dangers, or down the river with its currents and unexpected turns. There were spells to protect against demons and hostile spirits, spells to reveal secret passages through dark corridors, spells to restore the voice so the deceased could speak their name and claim their identity in the afterlife, ensuring that they could not be erased or forgotten. The Book of the Dead was democracy in spiritual form, a revolutionary idea that broke with later traditions. It was not exclusively for pharaohs and nobles, though they certainly had the most elaborate and beautiful versions written on the walls of their tombs in paint and precious materials. Even common people could possess their own copies, painted on cheaper materials or written in simpler form, sometimes merely carried in memory, because the ancient Egyptians believed that everyone deserved the knowledge to navigate the afterlife successfully, that spiritual wisdom should not be reserved for the elite alone. But before the soul could venture into the duat, it faced perhaps the most crucial moment of all, the judgment that would determine its eternal destiny, with finality and without appeal. Picture this scene, painted on countless tomb walls and preserved in papyri across the centuries, because the Egyptians wanted to rehearse this moment mentally and spiritually, to visualize it vividly so their souls would recognize it when the time came, so they would move through it with confidence and composure. In a great hall of judgment filled with divine light, the soul stands before Osiris, the god of the afterlife and resurrection, who sits in magnificent authority wearing the white crown and holding the crook and flail of kingship. The 42 divine judges are assembled in rows, cosmic beings who represent different aspects of moral law, different principles of truth and justice and virtue, each one embodying a different ethical principle. And there, in the centre of this profound courtroom of eternity, stands Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification and the dead, holding an enormous scale, a balance of cosmic proportions with its beam perfectly horizontal. On one side of this scale rests the heart of the deceased, that organ which the Egyptians believed was the true seat of consciousness, of memory, of intellect and emotion, of all that the person was and did during their entire lifetime, containing within it the record of every action and thought. On the other side is placed a single feather, light as air, delicate and pure, the feather of Ma'at, the goddess who embodies truth, justice, cosmic order, and moral integrity, representing the universal principles that govern all of existence. This is the weighing of the heart, and it represents the ultimate truth that what we do in life, how we live each day, the choices we make, the kindness we show, the honesty we maintain even when no one is watching, all of this has weight in a cosmic sense. All of this matters infinitely. The heart does not lie. It cannot be deceived or manipulated on that divine scale, for the gods can see into its deepest nature. If the heart is lighter than the feather, if the weight of truth and justice in the soul's being proves greater than any burden of wrongdoing or sin, then the soul is declared pure and righteous, and is allowed to pass onward to the field of reeds, to Earu, a paradise that mirrors the very best aspects of earthly life. Imagine a landscape of incredible beauty and peace, a place where the Nile flows eternally with cool, refreshing waters, where crops grow abundantly in perfectly irrigated fields that never fail, where the sun shines with warmth and comfort but never burns or punishes with excessive heat, where beloved family members who passed before wait in reunion and boundless joy. There the soul would live forever in perfect peace and contentment, cultivating divine fields and attending ceremonies and feasts, pursuing all the things it loved in life but with none of the struggle or suffering that mortal existence required. This was the hope that sustained the Egyptians through the challenges of existence, the vision that gave meaning to their struggles. This was the vision that made death not something to dread or resist, but something to prepare for thoughtfully and hopefully. But if the heart proved heavier, if the weight of deception and cruelty and injustice and selfishness outbalanced the feather of truth, then the soul faced a terrifying fate that was beyond reversal and without any possibility of redemption or appeal. Waiting beside the scale stood Amit, whose name means the devourer, a monstrous composite creature with the head of a crocodile, the front body of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, each element representing a different aspect of predatory nature. With terrible jaws that dripped with hunger, Ami would consume the heart of the unjust soul, and that heart, once devoured, would cease to exist in any form whatsoever. It would not go to an underworld or a place of punishment or suffering. It would simply cease, annihilated completely, and the soul would be erased from existence, never to be reborn, never to know eternity in any form. This was not punishment as much as natural consequence, the universe's automatic response to the reality of a life lived without truth or justice. The Egyptians understood that actions have consequences, that how we live matters infinitely and eternally, and that we cannot escape or hide from the truth of what we truly are, what our hearts reveal about us. To ensure that the soul would have everything it needed for this journey, and this destiny beyond the veil of death, the Egyptians filled tombs with extraordinary provisions and objects of great beauty and value. These were not mere objects placed for show or as expressions of wealth, but practical necessities for the afterlife as the ancient Egyptians conceived it. Model boats were placed in tombs because the soul would need to travel across celestial waters, just as the sun god Ra travelled each night across the waters of the sky in his divine boat, battling demons and dangers and monsters, before being reborn in the morning in a cycle that never ended. Model granaries were included because the soul would need sustenance, would need to eat and drink in the afterlife as it had in life, and the Egyptians believed these magical models would produce real food through divine power. Statues called shabte, small figurines of workers rendered in various poses, were placed throughout the tomb by the hundreds because the Egyptians believed these would magically come to life in the afterlife when called upon to perform labour and tasks on behalf of the deceased, allowing the soul to spend eternity in rest and contemplation and pleasure rather than in toil and labour. Tools and weapons and jewellery and cosmetics and games and furniture were all carefully selected and placed within the tomb, creating a complete environment for the soul to inhabit and use. The tombs were not meant to be dark and empty and cold, but to be homes, miniature universes containing everything necessary for a complete and comfortable existence in the realm beyond death. Particularly crucial were the canopic jars, 4 sacred vessels that held the vital organs removed during the mummification process and placed under the protection of 4 divine guardians. The liver, seat of emotion and desire, went into one jar under the protection of Imseti. The lungs went into another under Duamutef. The stomach, which would have absorbed food and drink in life, went into a third under Makenti. The intestines, representing the journey and passage through the body, went into the 4th under Kebzenuf. Each god held dominion over their specific organ, ensuring that all parts of the physical self were preserved and protected for the journey into eternity. The brain, however, was treated very differently by the embalmers, and this reveals something about Egyptian understanding of human nature. The ancient Egyptians, without the benefit of modern neuroscience and brain imaging, believed that the heart was the seat of all intelligence, memory, and consciousness, the true centre of thinking and feeling. The brain was simply tissue to be discarded, extracted through the nostrils and disposed of, an irony that makes us smile now in our modern knowledge, but demonstrates how earnestly they worked with the knowledge and understanding they possessed in their time. What mattered to them was preserving the organs they believed held the essence of the self, the seat of the soul's identity. The process of preservation itself was a sacred act, carried out with solemnity and reverence by skilled professionals trained in ancient traditions. Mummification took 70 days from start to finish, 70 days representing a transformation as profound as any spiritual initiation or rebirth ritual. First came the washing and purification of the body in sacred oils and waters, then the removal of the internal organs into the canopic jars through careful surgical technique. The body was then covered completely in natron salt, a mineral that the Egyptians found naturally in their desert, which drew out all moisture and desiccated the flesh, preserving it from decay and bacterial destruction. The natron was carefully applied and maintained for weeks in specific proportions and patterns, turning the living body gradually into something that could survive eternally, that could resist the bacteria and biological processes that would otherwise reduce it to dust within years. After the natron treatment came the washing again to remove the salt, and then the careful wrapping in linen layer upon layer, creating a protective cocoon of cloth that held the body securely. But the wrapping was not mere binding or covering. Between the layers of linen, prayers and protective amulets were placed with great care and intention. Scarabs were tucked over the heart to protect the soul's journey through the underworld. Eyes were inlaid to allow the mummy to see, should the soul choose to return and view the physical form. Amulets shaped like the eye of Horus were placed to restore power and wholeness. Ankhs, symbolizing eternal life, were positioned near vital areas of the body. The mummy became a sacred sculpture, a work of spiritual and physical engineering designed to house the soul or to serve as an anchor point for it. After all the wrapping was complete came the ceremony known as the opening of the mouth, a ritual of profound significance that sought to restore the senses and capacities to the mummy, to animate it spiritually if not physically. Priests would approach the mummy's face with tools specially designed for this sacred purpose, touching the mouth, the eyes, the ears, speaking incantations and prayers that would awaken these senses in the spiritual body of the deceased. The Egyptians understood something fundamental about the power of intention and ritual, something about how focused thought and sacred action can bridge the gap between the physical and the divine, bringing them into contact. By opening the mouth symbolically, they were saying to the soul words that had power, "You will speak and be heard in the afterlife. Your voice will matter. You will have agency and choice. You will be able to communicate and defend yourself and claim your rightful place in eternity." By opening the eyes, they said with equal power, "You will see the wonders of the afterlife. You will not be blind to beauty or truth. You will witness all that awaits you." The ceremony was an act of preparation and hope, performed by those who remained behind, reaching across the threshold of death to offer their loved one every advantage and blessing for the journey ahead, every protection and aid that love and tradition could provide. Throughout all of this long preparation, from the moment a person was born into ancient Egyptian society until the moment they died and were placed in their tomb, there was no irrational fear of death as we often experience it in modern times. Death was not something to dread or deny or push away from consciousness and daily thought. Death was a doorway, clearly marked and well lit by tradition and teaching, a passage that everyone knew they would someday have to walk through, just as every person in their society had walked through it before them. But it was a doorway opening into continuity, into meaning, into a structured realm where the rules were known and could be followed, where justice prevailed and truth was revealed, where the righteous were rewarded and the wicked faced consequences. The Egyptians looked at death and saw not emptiness but fullness, not ending but transformation, not something to fear but something to prepare for thoughtfully and with quiet dignity. This perspective, maintained across thousands of years and passed down through countless generations, created a culture in which death was integrated into life rather than separated from it as a taboo subject, feared rather than accepted, denied rather than embraced as a natural part of existence. The Egyptians walked this earth knowing that they would continue beyond it, and this knowledge shaped how they lived, how they created, how they built monuments and civilizations intended to last forever, because they themselves would last forever in some form, in some realm, transformed but continuous, their identity preserved and cherished in the eternal landscape of the afterlife, where they would know peace at last. As you rest now and begin to drift towards sleep, imagine yourself walking along the banks of the Nile as the sun sets, understanding what the ancient Egyptians knew so deeply. Feel the coolness of the evening air and recognize it as a boundary between worlds, a threshold moment between day and night, between consciousness and dreams, between the living world and the realm of rest and restoration. Think of the mummies lying in darkness in their sealed chambers, not suffering but sleeping, not trapped but preserved, not dead but transformed and waiting. Think of all those people across thousands of years who prepared so carefully for death, who decorated their tombs with images of paradise and joy, who filled their burial chambers with music and feasting and eternal life. Their faith was not naive or desperate, but grounded in a deep understanding of transformation and continuation. And now you too are approaching a small death, a nightly descent into the realm of dreams and darkness, where you will be restored and renewed just as the Egyptians believed their souls would be restored and renewed in the field of reeds. Your bed is like a tomb, a place of safety and enclosure, a sanctuary where you can let go of the day's struggles and be preserved in sleep. The darkness you're entering is not frightening but welcoming, not an ending but a transformation, a journey through night that will lead you back to morning and light and renewed life. More than a century has passed since Howard Carter first peered into the darkness of that sealed tomb, and the beam of his lamp illuminated treasures and objects untouched by human hands for more than 3,000 years, a moment that would change archaeology and captivate the world's imagination. Tutankhamun's golden mask, his beautiful throne, his ornate chariots, his countless objects of beauty and mystery have journeyed from that hidden chamber beneath the Egyptian sands into the light and scrutiny of the modern world, displayed now in the Grand Egyptian Museum in Cairo, one of the world's most extraordinary repositories of ancient human achievement and artistic expression. Millions of people have stood before these treasures across the decades, have gazed at the young pharaoh's face rendered in gold and precious stones and lapis lazuli, and felt something profound shift within them, a sense that human beings, throughout all of history and across all cultures, reach toward immortality, toward permanence, toward the preservation of what they hold most dear and most essential to their identity. These objects speak across the millennia as eloquently as any voice could, telling stories of belief and devotion, of engineering and artistry, of a civilization that understood something about death and memory and the nature of human consciousness that our modern minds are still working to comprehend fully and integrate into our understanding of existence. The treasures have been subjected to scientific examination using technology that would have seemed like pure magic or fantasy to Howard Carter and his contemporaries in the early 20th century. Techniques that allow us to see inside objects without damaging them or disturbing their sacred integrity. High-resolution CT scans have created detailed three-dimensional maps of the interior of Tutankhamun's mummy, revealing the exact state of his preservation throughout the millennia, the precise location of his internal organs, the nature of his injuries and illnesses, the marks that disease and time left upon his fragile bones. DNA analysis has been performed carefully on his remains, extracting the genetic code from bone samples to establish his family relationships with certainty that would have seemed impossible before modern science, confirming that he was indeed the biological child of Akhenaten, establishing definitively that his mother was likely one of Akhenaten's own daughters, revealing the significant genetic consequences of this close kinship between his parents. Modern archaeology and modern molecular biology have together lifted the veil that time had drawn over this young man's body, allowing us to read his physical form like an ancient text, to understand something concrete of his life and the circumstances of his death across the vast gulf of thousands of years. The scientific investigation has revealed several intriguing and competing possibilities regarding how Tutankhamun met his end at such a young age, possibilities that scholars continue to debate and investigate with new technology. CT scans showed a fracture in his femur, the long bone of his thigh, a break that may have occurred near the time of his death, or possibly during the mummification process when his body was being handled carefully, but necessarily by the embalmers who needed to prepare it for eternity. Some scholars propose that this fracture resulted from a chariot accident or a fall from a height, injuries that could have led to complications and infection and ultimately death. Others believe the fracture occurred after death during the careful manipulation required by the mummification process itself. The analysis of his genetic material revealed that he likely carried the parasite that causes malaria, a tropical disease that would have caused fever and suffering and could have contributed significantly to his death, or even caused it directly through complications. His DNA also indicated that he may have had clubfoot and other physical conditions and deformities, all resulting from the genetic consequences of his parents' close kinship between blood relatives, a practice that was rare but not unknown among Egyptian royalty who believed themselves to be divine, and therefore exempt from the normal laws that governed human reproduction among common people. There are those scholars and historians who have suggested, based on the evidence of the fracture and the circumstances of his death at only 19 years of age, that he may have been murdered, perhaps by those who sought to control the throne or to prevent him from undoing further religious and political reforms. Yet despite all the scientific investigation and technological advancement, despite the sophisticated equipment and methods that modern researchers can bring to bear upon the ancient body, the truth remains elusive and tantalizing as it has for centuries. We may never know with complete certainty what caused Tutankhamun to die so young, why the boy who ruled as Pharaoh of Egypt for nearly a decade passed into the afterlife while still in his adolescence and full youth. The mystery endures as it has for thousands of years, and perhaps this is fitting and appropriate, for it preserves something of the wonder and the profound uncertainty that surrounded his life and his death, even in his own time among those who knew him. Yet the work of discovery and investigation continues forward into the future. Ground-penetrating radar technology and other remote sensing equipment has been deployed carefully in the Valley of the Kings to search beneath the sand without disturbing it, to map the unseen chambers and passages that lie hidden from human sight beneath centuries of debris and geological layers. Some researchers have suggested, based on preliminary findings, that there may still be undiscovered rooms within or adjacent to Tutankhamun's tomb, hidden chambers yet to be explored, treasures yet to be recovered and studied. The possibility of additional discoveries has captured the imagination and enthusiasm, not only of professional archaeologists and scholars, but of the entire world, people everywhere who find themselves drawn to ancient Egypt and the mysteries it contains, yearning to understand the beliefs and achievements of this remarkable civilization. Perhaps there is more to find buried in the sand of the valley. Perhaps the story of Tutankhamun's tomb, the story of this boy king's journey into eternity and then into fame and immortality, is not yet complete, and there remain secrets waiting to be revealed to those patient enough to search methodically. There is a profound and striking irony in Tutankhamun's fame across the world, an irony so remarkable and unexpected that it might seem like the work of fate or divine destiny. Yet it arose simply from the accidents of geography and history that governed his tomb's preservation through the centuries. In his own time, during his lifetime and throughout his reign, Tutankhamun was a relatively insignificant figure in the long history of Egyptian pharaohs spanning thousands of years of civilization and empire. His reign lasted less than a decade in an empire that endured for millennia. His accomplishments were minimal and modest compared to great rulers like Thutmose III or Rameses the Great, who conquered empires and built monuments that still stand today. His reforms were carefully conservative, designed to restore tradition rather than innovate or challenge the established order. His impact on the empire was limited and localized, affecting primarily the religious institutions and the aristocracy. When he died at only 19 years of age, his death appears to have been noted by his court without great ceremony or extended mourning rituals, as if the event was accepted with resignation and moved past quickly. His name was removed from official king lists by his successors and their successors, erased from the records as if his existence was something that never truly was, that needed to be forgotten and undone, struck from official memory and the historical record as thoroughly as possible. Yet through a remarkable chain of circumstances that no one could have predicted or deliberately arranged, this young man who was so thoroughly erased from the historical record became the most famous pharaoh in the world, more famous than great conquerors and builders and powerful administrators who shaped empires and built monuments and established laws. His face, rendered beautifully in gold and lapis lazuli on the mask that covered his mummy, has become the iconic face of ancient Egypt itself to modern consciousness. Children who know nothing whatsoever of Egyptian history or ancient civilizations know the name Tutankhamun. The boy who was so thoroughly erased from the historical record in his own time and by his successors has become immortal in a way that far greater pharaohs and more powerful rulers never achieved or experienced despite their vast resources and power. The irony that shaped this remarkable and unexpected transformation was the very condition that had seemed to doom him to permanent obscurity and historical insignificance, because his tomb was small and humble compared to the vast monuments and elaborate burial chambers of other kings, because it was overlooked by the tomb builders and grave robbers who came after him across the centuries and epochs, because it was accidentally sealed beneath the huts of workers and the accumulated detritus of centuries and grains of sand. It survived largely intact and undisturbed in a way that almost no other royal burial ever did, while the magnificent tombs of greater pharaohs were systematically ransacked and emptied by thieves seeking precious metals and treasures to sell and profit from. The very smallness and insignificance that made Tutankhamun a minor figure in his own time became the condition that preserved him for eternity, in ways that greater tombs could never be preserved. If the tomb of Rameses II had been discovered completely intact with all its treasures undisturbed and preserved, it would have been one remarkable discovery among many throughout the history of archaeology. But Tutankhamun, the minor pharaoh, the forgotten king, offered something unique and irreplaceable and unprecedented. The complete, largely untouched record of a pharaonic burial, a snapshot and window into ancient Egyptian funerary practice, preserved in a way that nothing else had been preserved, or could be preserved. Being forgotten became paradoxically the secret to being remembered forever. Obscurity in one age became immortality in another. The boy who was erased from the historical record became the symbol of ancient Egypt itself, the most famous face from 3,000 years of history. The boy king who conquered death through forgetting. The world has come to know Tutankhamun not for what he accomplished during his lifetime, not for his military victories or his building projects or his religious reforms that restored the old priest to power and reversed the dramatic changes of Akhenaten. The world knows him because of how he died at such a young age, because of what was placed in his tomb by those who loved him and cared for him after death, because of the journey his body was taken on through the complex process of mummification and burial and the sacred rituals of preparation for the afterlife. He became immortal not through the works he did or the laws he enacted during his brief reign, but through the sacred objects that accompanied him into death, through the golden mask and the beautiful throne and the countless treasures that spoke eloquently to his importance in his society and to the beliefs and values of his people about death and the afterlife. A boy king, unremarkable and nearly forgotten in his own time, became an immortal image and icon, a symbol not of power or achievement or conquest, but of the eternal human desire to reach beyond death, to preserve what is precious, to be remembered and honoured even after death, to continue in some form beyond the grave and beyond the reach of time itself. His face became the face of ancient Egypt itself in the modern imagination, the image that represents the entire civilization to modern eyes and consciousness around the world. The Valley of the Kings remains as it has for centuries, a sacred and timeless landscape where the kings of Egypt chose to be buried, a place where the earth itself seems to hold the weight of thousands of years of history and mystery and loss, where the desert whispers ancient stories to those patient enough to listen carefully with open hearts. The modern world passes through the valley in buses and cars and organised tour groups. Tourists photograph the carved tomb entrances and the mummified remains in museums, and then move on with their lives back to the present world. Yet beneath the sand there are more tombs waiting to be found, more secrets hidden from human eyes, more stories waiting patiently to be discovered by archaeologists patient and dedicated enough to search methodically, meticulous enough to document their findings carefully and respectfully, and fortunate enough to stumble upon intact chambers where time has been frozen in place and precious objects remain exactly as they were left millennia ago by those who loved and honoured the deceased. Technology continues to advance and improve year after year as human knowledge expands. New tools and techniques constantly emerge to peer beneath the surface of the sand without disturbing it or damaging it. And perhaps one day, another significant discovery will come to light. Another royal tomb will be opened to modern eyes. Another pharaoh's treasures will see light again after thousands of years of peaceful darkness and silence in the earth. Thank you for spending this time with the Calm Archive. If you'd like more stories like this, subscribing really does make a difference. As night falls over Egypt, as the stars emerge over the Valley of the Kings in their eternal patterns, the temperature drops steadily. The desert air that burned so fiercely and harshly during the day becomes cool and then cold. The ancient stones settle into stillness and silence, and the sand that surrounds them keeps its eternal silence and mysteries. Somewhere beneath that sand, in sealed chambers untouched for millennia, the dead rest as they have rested through the long centuries and ages, their bodies preserved perfectly, their treasures waiting in darkness, their stories encoded in the objects that lie with them in those sacred chambers. Tutankhamun rests too, though no longer in his hidden tomb beneath the sand where he lay for thousands of years undiscovered and protected. His body now displayed in museums for millions to view and contemplate, his treasures displayed and studied by scholars and researchers, his story told and retold across the world and across generations through countless books and documentaries and conversations. But the feeling and the essence of his tomb remains in the hearts of those who understand and feel the profound significance of what was preserved, the sense of time made tangible and real, of history made physical and present, of human aspiration and human mortality brought together in a small underground chamber sealed away from the world. This young king who lived so briefly, who ruled so modestly, who was so thoroughly forgotten in his own time, has become a bridge between our modern world and the ancient past, a connection across the vast gulf of millennia. As sleep takes hold of you now, as your consciousness begins its nightly journey into dreams and restoration and renewal and healing, it is not so different from the journey the ancient Egyptians envisioned for their dead and prepared them so carefully to undertake in all their spiritual and practical preparations. You too are passing through a threshold between waking and sleep, travelling through a darkness that is not frightening but welcoming, finding rest in a place that feels timeless and suspended, separate from the waking world of demands and struggle and constant activity. The tomb's darkness mirrors the darkness of sleep where dreams live and flourish, where the soul travels freely unbound by the laws of physics or logic. The silence of the tomb mirrors the silence of dreams, where only the soul speaks to itself, where inner truths are revealed and processed and integrated. The preservation of ancient objects in sealed chambers mirrors the way sleep preserves us each night, holding us safely in suspension, keeping us secure and protected while our bodies and minds are restored and renewed for the challenges of the coming day. As you close your eyes, imagine the Valley of the Kings as it was thousands of years ago. Imagine the priests performing the opening of the mouth ceremony, Imagine the soul of a young pharaoh beginning its eternal journey into the field of reeds, where it would rest forever in peace. And now you too are beginning your nightly journey, your own small death and rebirth, your own passage through darkness toward restoration and renewal. The peace of the tomb is now the peace of sleep. The preservation of the ancient dead is now the preservation of you, held safely in the darkness, protected and restored by the body's own ancient wisdom. Sweet dreams,